beautiful day and to talk about a subject that most everybody wants to ignore. And that is the reason that my group, Nukewatch, has reissued the first revised edition of our book, Nuclear Heartland, to try to, again, bring public attention to these archaic, dangerous, and redundant nuclear weapons that are based throughout the Great Plains states. Nuclear Heartland in 1988 was the very first time that maps of the silos and the locations were made public to the American people in a direct way. It took a lot of deep research to find where these were before these maps shocked the public into a realization of how large the nuclear arsenal is and how close these individual weapons are to regular neighborhoods, communities, farms. Since 1988, of course, when there were 1,000 missiles dotting throughout 6 different missile fields, as they're called, each of these 3 fields are the ones that are left. There used to be 6. So 550 have been removed as a result of arms treaties or reduction treaties signed during various administrations, always as the result of massive international protest against these weapons. But the problem with the retention of these 450 is most people in the country have the idea that they all went away at the end of the Cold War. But in fact, they are retained with great relish by the Air Force, by the Navy on giant submarines, and by the Air Force on large heavy bombers where gravity bombs are still retained too. We argue, obviously, as many of you have in your own lives and your work, that these weapons are redundant. They're arguably unlawful in terms of international humanitarian law. They have failed miserably as a deterrent to attacks on the U.S. and its allies around the world. They're accident-prone and now corruption-ridden, something I'll get into a little later. As to what we do get from them, they produce a few votes for congressional and senatorial campaigns. The contractors who make and modernize these weapons get to contribute a lot of campaign funds to congressional reps and senators. They produce a lot of fear and radioactive waste as well, as we all know. Well, as I said, there were 6 of these fields initially established in the 60s by the Air Force that wanted to be able to massively retaliate against a Soviet attack with weapons, about 1,000, that would theoretically fly over the North Pole and attack targets in Russia or China. Of course, these weapons are tested east and west from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, shot out over the Pacific. They've never been launched over the magnetic pole, so who knows if these weapons would work in any case. When we did this research, I think my former partner Barb Catt and I are the only people in the country, maybe the world, who have visited all 1,000 of these missile sites. It took 3 months. We drove 30,000 miles. We drove to each and every one to produce the road directions of this nuclear war atlas, you could call it, the first one in '88. That was a sobering experience, you can imagine. It took place over the course of the winter, 3 months on the road, where we met a lot of great Coloradan peace activists and peace activists all over the country, Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana, South and North Dakota. Hundreds of people working against nuclear weapons and the increase of it that took place under Ronald Reagan and then subsequent presidents. As you can see, these things are pretty densely packed in the Great Plains. How it works is that each of these little boxes hold 10 missiles and 1 launch control center. The LCC is where the actual Air Force missileers do their 12-hour shifts, underground mostly, standing, sitting, sleeping, at the ready to accept maintenance or to launch these weapons. And they are on alert status. All these years after the end of the Cold War, they're still able to be launched in a matter of minutes. Between 15 and 30 minutes, they can supposedly blast off to their targets around the world. They have a missile field that almost encircles the city of Minot, North Dakota, and stretch out near Great Falls, Montana as well. So as I said, most of the people in this country had no idea about the size of this arsenal when Nukewatch, led by our founder and late mastermind Sam Day, had the idea of making these maps public. What they also made public was how close they are to regular homes. Elementary schools. As you can see, heavy trucks are on the missile silo doing some maintenance in this photo. The fences are used to keep out, there's the cattle because they're placed right in the middle of ranchers' fields. One big difference that this nuclear weapon system has between it and the others, the submarines and the heavy bombers, is that ordinary people can approach right up to the fence in these things. Submarines are deep inside Navy bases. The bombers are deep inside air bases. But these are perfectly vulnerable. They have a simple chain link fence, a little barbed wire on the top, and they've been subject to hundreds and hundreds of protests, especially since the first publication of the maps. Here's a group of Mennonites who came across the border from Canada and completely encircled one of the silos. That's about a 4-acre plot, so it takes about 200 people to do so. That was a fun exercise. I mean, it shows the vulnerability of these things to, say, saboteurs. If there was really any Soviet threat, then ordinary spies could have thrown a little glue or some cement into any one of these things any time. It takes hours sometimes for Air Force security to come out as a result of a little alert that sometimes takes place. Oftentimes it's just a bird or a red squirrel or a fox bumping into the fence, and so the Air Force doesn't even bother to run out. In this particular case, Barbara and I wondered about the Soviet threat too, because this missile silo was left wide open all weekend, unattended, during some maintenance. A couple buckets of cement could have done some real damage to this. Nevertheless, the Air Force and the rest of the Pentagon propaganda machine makes use of this deterrence as the rationale for retaining these weapons. The New York Times and the other major papers play along, and one particular look back at the missiles done by the New York Times in 1995 said that the fences were designed to foil Soviet saboteurs. Here's Barb and I doing a couple of what we call today selfies. We just hop the fence and investigate and walk out, and it's still an hour before we drive away, an hour before the military police show up. What we learned from high school students during this research was kind of funny too, because in North Dakota, maybe there's not a lot to do on the weekend. The high schoolers told us they'd take some beer and cigarettes and hang out in their cars, and they'd park a little ways away. They'd run up, rattle the fence, and then go back, hide in their cars, and wait for the MPs to come out. Just for kicks. That's how you get thrills in North Dakota. Well, back in '88, there were Minuteman II missiles and some Minuteman IIIs. The IIIs being the more modern, more accurate. But the Minuteman IIs were actually more powerful. They had 1.2 megaton warheads on those missiles back then. 8,000 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb on one missile warhead. The small, crude Hiroshima device killed 140,000 people, and it incinerated 7 square miles. That was a tiny little atom bomb compared to what was on the Minuteman II. By comparison, back in 1988, everything else being equal, the missiles could have destroyed 7.5 billion people and flattened 100,000 square miles. Nowadays, we're much more civilized and moderate. Where there were 3, as in this picture, 335 kiloton warheads, way down from 1.2 megatons. Nowadays, they've been reduced to single warhead rockets. So there's 1 warhead and 1 rocket for every red dot there on the maps, instead of 3 like in the picture. And this is so reasonable and moderate. The single 335 kiloton warheads, or 300 kilotons, they vary, is only 20 times the force of the Hiroshima bomb. They can potentially incinerate 23,000 square miles, half the size of the state of Ohio. They can kill 1.26 billion people. A single Minuteman III missile today can destroy, the entire arsenal of 450 is 23,000 square miles. One single Minuteman missile, 51 square miles it could incinerate, which is the size roughly of Chicago, population and square miles wise. You know, for many decades, we saw maybe these pictures, mostly pictures of mushroom clouds from Hiroshima. Pictures of actual human victims of what happened there were kept secret for 25 years. It was very difficult for the government to do this, and they've been divulged only slowly over the years.